Russia has one of the strongest navies in the world, yet they have one of the most vulnerable navies in the world. In this video, I want to talk about something called warm water ports, and a warm water port is extremely vital to your navy. So a warm water port is exactly what it sounds like. It is where the water never freezes all year around, and that port is a stable living environment for a ship. Something else to consider before we get to where the Russians have issues is that a warm water port, it doesn't only need to be warm all year around, but it also needs to be deep enough for you to manage your ships. So, as most of us know, Russia does have a powerful navy, and they are a navy that is a legit threat to everyone in the world, more specifically because of their nuclear capabilities within their submarine class. But the one thing really holding back the Russian Navy is the lack of warm water ports. And wait till you see these numbers. So, for example, the United States has way more access to warm water ports. I mean, we even have almost the whole state of Hawaii, Florida, Louisiana, Texas. All of these warm water ports Russia wishes they could have. Now, I want you to take a guess. Let me know how many warm water ports you think Russia has. Leave it down below because I think this may shock some of you. Russia only has access to 2 warm water ports. You heard that right. One of the most powerful navies in the world only has access to 2 warm water ports. Now, let me break this down for you because it's not so black and white. So, there is one main headquarters where the Russian Navy predominantly docks. Like, most of their ships dock here. This is where they do most of the repairs for their ships. It's in Crimea, Sevastopol. Now, I know a lot of your gears are turning, and I know a lot of you are saying this. Crimea does not belong to Russia. Crimea was annexed by Russia. So, how exactly are they able to function and work out of Sevastopol? Ready for this one? I know a lot of you didn't know this. Ukraine actually had a lease agreement with the Russians to allow the Russian Navy to be stationed there, to work on your ships. Because again, Sevastopol is a deep and warm water port. But things have changed. Now, of course, Russia annexed Crimea, and Russia says this is our port, Sevastopol, which again is a deep, warm water port. And we will get into why this could be dangerous for Russia. One of the biggest issues for Russia, especially in recent times, with the Ukraine war and recent drone attacks that have happened in Crimea, everyone knows where their ships are, and it can be very difficult to work on your ships when you have a constant threat of drone attacks. But for Russia, this risk is totally worth it because they are probably the major superpower controlling the Black Sea. And even though they are accessible by drone strikes from the air or drone strikes from sea, they seem to be handling the situation rather well. However, Russia does have a little trick up their sleeve. Before I get to that, you need to realize that just because they have this one warm water port, they also have access for at least half of the year to their other ports, especially on Russia's eastern seaboards. I mean, let's also remember China and Russia have a very strong mutual military agreement. So I'm willing to bet it's safe to say that China would allow Russia to bring in their ships on their eastern seaboards if they needed to work on Russian ships in China. Now, here's Russia's little trick. They actually have a second warm water port, but not near Russia, not near Ukraine. It's actually in Syria. So, as we all know, history tends to repeat itself, especially in the case of Russia. But Syria doesn't seem to mind, and the reason why I say history repeats itself, Syria has a lease agreement with Russia, and the warm water port location is in Tartus. Now, the thing about the port in Tartus, it's actually a lot safer than the port up in Crimea. Even though we know that Syria is heavily contested with Islamist groups, there's always been militant factions fighting one another recently, it doesn't matter. It's actually relatively safe for the Russians. This port is also really hard to access from outside entities, so if a faction was going to plan an attack on the Russian Navy, they would have a lot of issues because this port geographically is inland. So again, it's really hard to access and hard to attack. Now, I know a lot of you love surprises and secrets, so I'm just gonna say this now. Russia actually has one more surprise up their sleeve, but before we get to that, we need to realize that this port also allows access to the entire Mediterranean Sea for the Russian Navy. Now, this works in favor for Russia. This is extremely important because realize a lot of NATO members who can't stand Russia and wants to help Ukraine and take out Russia, Russia can simply deploy a fleet into the Mediterranean and almost no one can contest them within the European navies. But there is one major pain in the butt as far as Russia being in Syria and thinking they're okay in Syria. The United States is also in Syria. Now, there are about 900 deployed troops in Syria, and things are actually starting to pop off in Syria again at the time of making this video. But these are not Navy ships, these are Army soldiers. The reason why it doesn't matter that Navy ships are not in Syria, because again, remember, the US Navy has plenty of warm water ports, and the US Navy is everywhere at all times. The US Navy is in the Mediterranean to block off any potential of a Russian attack. Now, even though it's a small number of troops, 900 troops, it doesn't matter. The Russian Navy stationed in Tartus, they still need to be considerate and still need to be very careful what they do or don't do because they could instigate a problem amongst the Syrians, amongst the government, and amongst the United States. Now, there is one more trick up Russia's sleeve, and I think this is actually a very strong strategic move. They have signed another lease agreement with the Venezuelans. Now, if you are starting to see a pattern here, Russia tends to become really good friends with you if you happen to have an unstable government, if you happen to have an unstable population where they can't stand their government, and if you happen to have access to warm water ports. Now, if I'm being fair and honest, the situation in Venezuela was arguably instigated by the United States. And what I mean by that is the United States was extremely critical on Venezuela. There was a lot of corruption going on amongst its government. Its own people didn't like what the government was doing. I'm not going to get into details. Go look that up. But essentially, Russia saw this as the door opening to go support Venezuela. We want to show you guys that we are here to support you. You know what? We'll even park some of our ships at your ports so that the US Navy and the US can't do anything. Now notice, this sounds like the same exact blocking maneuver that the United States is doing in Syria. I know it doesn't sound like much, but when you have a military who's a nuclear power and they're operating within a country, you can't really perform any military operations. It's almost like whoever gets here first, you can't step here. So, as we look at the pattern of these warm water ports, it always seems to be a lease agreement, the country destabilizes, and now all of a sudden, it's our port. And I really think that's actually the biggest major flaw for Russia. Now, I can only speculate and say what the US government is thinking and why the US military is willing to deploy to these specific regions in Syria. The United States, they are witnessing the same pattern over and over again. Destabilization and annex, and now they control these warm water ports. Another severe issue for Russia and these warm water ports are not exactly in control of Russia 100%. Think of it like this. You have an apartment. You don't own it, you lease it. And for the most part, you can kind of do whatever you want, but at any time you can get kicked out. That's what the issue is with these lease agreements. So, I hope you learned the importance of warm water ports. Again, please leave your comments and opinions below about the Russia situation and warm water ports. As I always end my videos, I will give my final thought and opinion. I think Russia will do anything it takes to maintain and keep the warm water ports in Syria and in Crimea, especially in Syria. They will do whatever it takes to help destabilize that government if they need to. I am not totally convinced they care that much about the situation in Venezuela. That's just more of a pain in the butt for the United States, and now the United States has to pay attention to Russia and Venezuela. And that's good for Russia. If Russia can do anything it takes to make the US look this way and not over here where they're trying to perform operations like in Africa, Russia did get a win by taking Venezuela. That's good. But they will always, always, always have a constant issue in maintaining and getting warm water ports.